Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. I'm Adam Huss, coming to you from Los Angeles, California, as usual. Thank you so much for listening. I recently introduced a new sponsor for the podcast, Catavino Tours. One of the main reasons I decided to partner with Catavino Tours was because of their founder, Ryan Opaz. His wine journey has led him to become a thoughtful wine business owner with deep ecological consciousness gained from decades of working at nearly every level in the wine industry. Besides being the founder and CEO of Catavino with his wife and partner Gabriella, he runs a natural and organic wine shop in Porto, Portugal, co-authored and was the photographer of the James Beard Award-nominated book Foot-Trodden, Portugal and the Wines That Time Forgot. Previously, he was also the photographer for the book The Amber Revolution and a book about Porto's Bolhão market. For his service to the Portuguese wine industry, he has also been inducted as a knight of the Port Wine Brotherhood. Yes, this is a conversation with not only a knight, but a wine knight. One of the admirable qualities of Ryan that comes up in this interview is his desire to remind all of us in wine that answers to questions and solutions to problems aren't universally applicable and timeless. That is, the issues we face are complex, context-dependent, and we would be wise to resist the impulse to simplify questions to single answers or problems to single solutions. And even when we think we've found a way forward, we should continue to research and explore and be willing to find that we need to change our approach again next year. We also talk a lot about emissions offsets. If you've been paying attention to the news about carbon offsets from John Oliver to The Guardian, you'll know that there are a lot of problems with offsets. In fact, there are more than problems. There is a massive amount of deception and outright fraud. Ryan brings up some really interesting ideas about offsets that I think are important to consider, and his efforts to make his wine tourism company less wasteful and more ecologically positive have brought up some really good questions that I think we will all be wrestling with over the next decade or so. And I'm currently in discussion with a reputable company who does offsets to do a future episode entirely devoted to this hard question and the many nuances around these issues. So stay tuned. The most important thing may not be that we seek ways to offset every ounce of carbon from our lives, but that we begin to see that all of our choices and actions have ecological consequences, that there is a cost to everything we do. And if we aren't paying for it, it's likely that the earth or someone or something else is. Full disclosure, Ryan's company is a sponsor for the Organic Wine Podcast, and you can support this podcast by visiting catavinotours.com/OWP for Organic Wine Podcast and booking a tour with Ryan. I'm really glad to have Ryan as a sponsor, and I think this interview will help you see why. Enjoy. Ryan, welcome. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate you coming on to have this conversation.
I'm super excited. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's going to be fun.
I would love you to just introduce yourself a bit and talk about where you are and why you're there and how you got there and what you do, because I think you have an interesting story.
Well, we want to keep this under 4 hours, so I'll try to keep it brief.
Right. Highlights, yeah.
Yeah, I've been slinging boxes since 1998, I think. I got out of college and got a little job in a wine shop so I could learn a few things. So I've been in the industry for a few years. During that time, I've done everything from running wine shops to consulting wineries on social media to running a large communications conference throughout Europe. I've done retail, I've made wine, I've sold wine. So since 2000, end of 2004, my wife and I have lived in Europe. It was in 2004 we moved to Madrid, which was both probably the smartest and dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. We had no language, no job, no money, no place to live at first. And we bought 2 tickets and jumped on a plane and moved to Madrid with the idea that those things didn't matter.
I've been there. I know exactly what you mean. Bright-eyed, detailed American naivete.
Exactly. I thought everyone would want my help, and I found that I needed everybody else's help, and which was humbling and good learning. But I wanted to live in Europe before I was 30, and I moved there 3 months before I turned 30. So I accomplished that. And then we promised I forget, we had so little money in our bank account. It was embarrassingly small amount of money. And we said, well, we'll give up when we get so little money can buy a plane ticket home.
Right.
And I remember looking at our bank account at some point and realizing we didn't have enough money to buy a plane ticket home. And I was like, I guess we're staying. So we we lived in Madrid for a couple of years, and we moved up near Barcelona. And during that time, I had a consulting business helping. We built the first wine blog for a winery in Europe back in 2005, back when bloggers were called blaggers by Robert Parker, and people basically poo-pooed us as something that was irrelevant, kind of like we do with influencers today. And
Oh, that's a good
yeah,
analogy.
we were the first bloggers in the Circle of Wine Writers, and it's pretty prestigious in the UK. But yeah, we did that for a long time. And in 2013, my wife had just gotten pregnant with our only son. And before he was born, we moved to Porto in Portugal, which always felt a bit more like home to us. We have some long historical roots to Portugal, and we moved to Porto where we had a lot of friends we had built up from the wine industry and others, and haven't looked back. It's been an absolute pleasure being here, and now we're Portuguese citizens, and we run a small natural wine shop, organic wine shop, run a luxury wine tourism business, and don't do as much consulting. Written a book, a couple books,
Yeah. Wrote
a
wrote
few
a
other
book
things.
wrote a book about Portugal, Foot-Trodden,
Yeah.
for anybody who wants a great book about Portugal. Port- Portuguese wine. Uh, Definitely worth checking out, and beautiful because you are also a photographer, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so I've done 3 books, photos of. We did a book about a market here called Bolhão Market, and then I did some. I'm sure some of your listeners know the book Amber Revolution,
Mm,
which is all about orange wine.
right.
My co-author for Foot-Trodden, I did the photos for his book Amber Revolution, and then we co-wrote, and I did the photos for Foot-Trodden, which was something we ended up doing because we were working on Amber Revolution and drinking a lot of Portuguese wine as we traveled together, and we realized that there were no books about Portuguese wine, which was really interesting because there's a lot of like textbooks about Portuguese wine, but we didn't have a book that actually told stories about Portugal in a way that we wanted to understand Portugal. So I like to say it's a book about Portugal through the lens of wine. And Portugal itself is basically a place where wine is the lifeblood of so much that happens here. You can't go anywhere in Portugal without seeing a vine, to put it
Mm.
simply. And so yeah, that book was a lot of fun to do. We've had a lot of interesting and good feedback from it, and it focuses a lot on your topic, which not so much organic, but the idea of sustainability and how
Yeah.
we might have moved away from that, and now how we're starting to return.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just in talking with you, you've kind of conveyed this idea of the isolation of Portugal has made it a really interesting window through which to see, the green revolution as it applies to wine. And I mean, I think you've said something about knowing specifically when the first chemical pesticide, where it was used, who used it, when it was used in
Yeah.
Portugal. Can you talk a little bit about that? I
Yeah,
think that's
so I
really
mean,
fascinating.
well, I mean, we love Portugal on so many levels, and there's so many wines here that are like people don't even realize. Some of the best sparkling wines, in my opinion, in Europe are made here. Even my friends in Champagne often mock me and say, "Please don't serve these to people, Ryan. They're too good." Um, Portugal's like this mystery to so many people because for so long it was just port wine. And
Mm,
port wine is a British construct. In fact, the Portuguese don't really drink port wine. It's not a
right.
cultural beverage here. Um, and so yeah, when we were writing the book, we were looking for stories and trying to find people who were doing things or could tell stories about the the truth behind Portugal's wines and not what happened in the 90s, which was a point at which essentially after we entered the EU, due to some very complex laws around port wine trade, a lot of people took to trying to commercialize table wines to the exterior markets. And the Portuguese basically had to take and prove themselves. And so people went out and they started to try to make wines in a style that would score points and get
Mm,
recognition. And what we saw was that these wines were often wines that borrowed the narrative of other regions just so they could show that it could be done. In other words, show that we can make great wine. But they ignored or turned a blind eye to some of the quote unquote rustic or less sophisticated traditions of making wine here. And so to your point about the first chemicals, we when looking at the book, and you probably run into this yourself, you have people today even who are like, oh, organic wine has a special flavor or unique taste, or it's different.
Right.
And what we thought was funny is we hear this a lot. And then we found this guy down in Baixada, which is a region just south of Porto, who is the father of a good friend of ours, a winemaker. And we were talking to him, and it turns out this is the guy who had the first shipment, basically, of some of the more toxic and virulent strains of pesticides, and brought him in. And that was in 1950, probably getting it wrong, around 56 or something. So anything prior to 56, and I'm not going to say was 100% organic because there was things like DDT and things, but there was not. Portugal was so poor, there wasn't the huge amount of industrial fertilizers, definitely not the pesticides because they didn't exist yet. And so what we found funny is we'd sit with people who talk about the strangeness of organic wines and then talk about the greatness of the great 45 port and the 29 port and stuff. And we're like, those were organic, right?
Right.
those are made in very traditional, non-interventionist ways. So
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I mean, I so much. I mean, it's such a good microcosm. I just think of the wine world in general to hear these kind of timelines, because I just so much of what is just unquestioned about what is considered to be the standard wine world, what is the revered wine, what is called classic, or classical wine, is actually just a few years old, just a few decades old. Like we made it up in the last few decades, and to think, and the classic, if we really want to talk classic, it's natural wine. It's organically grown wine. Like that's what's funny about this idea of like, oh, whatever it is, like it really is such a short brief window of time that these things have been normalized, and now they're considered classic. I mean, it's like,
well, that
yeah,
that was, I mean, the first time I had this realization was working on the Amber Evolution book, which basically we have to remember wine historically and for pretty much 99% of its existence was a calorie preservation device. Full stop. A farmer grew calories and had to make sure those calories lasted so that his family stayed alive. So you could dry those grapes and that lasts a little bit, or you could ferment them and it lasts a bit longer. You could turn that to vinegar, which is very nutritious, and until very recently, and even today, people are reviving the tradition of drinking vinegars and things called shrubs. But you could distill it too and then have a very concentrated form of those calories. But because of that, we know for a fact that why would you ever take skins away from white wine if your goal is to preserve it? Because that's where the antioxidants and the preservatives are that are naturally in the grape. So when Simon was working on the book and finished it, it was like this idea that white wine is white without skin contact is like a drop in the historical timeline of wine. It's
and completely
it's an anomaly.
Yeah, and completely dependent on technology. Like what I want to call greenhouse gas emitting technology, essentially, like technology that requires power, and power derived from burning fossil fuels to operate. Outside inputs like an infrastructure of an electrical grid and that kind of stuff, or something like that. I mean, you couldn't make what is considered the norm for white wine now 100 years ago. It was impossible.
Yeah, I mean,
Or near 100. I don't know. It might have been a little.
But even all the clarification and stuff. I mean, obviously we had the egg whites and things, but today there's so many things to clarify and to stabilize the temperature and everything else.
Right.
And I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, there are great white wines. I'm not against some of these things.
No,
but it is funny that those people have their nose in the air saying we're the real thing. And it's like you just showed up in the last, it's like that timeline of the universe. And like
Right,
the
right,
human segment is like a human hair's width at the very end,
right,
and
right.
that's the entire existence of humans. That's somewhat like white wine is to wine, because ever since it was first, accidentally fermented on the vine or wherever, or in a sack of somebody carrying grapes, it was with its skins. It was tannic. It had all of those different characters. I'm not saying that was delicious, and I'm not saying that maybe that was something I want to drink today, but wine's been around a lot longer than we think,
Yeah,
and some of these modern ideas, from oak flavor to white wine itself, is basically, we have a few decades worth of playtime with it.
yeah, and I mean, to your point as well. I mean, there's so many things that I want to just immediately jump into, but you brought up how port isn't even something that's drunk by the Portuguese. That and this is really a reflection in the and I love the term the New World, because it just shows how Eurocentric what is considered normal wine culture really is, like how just tied to looking out from the shores of the European continent it is, but how in the New World, really all of the New World wine culture is exported by the English. It is literally like an English take on European wine culture that they couldn't participate in because their climate sucked until recently for growing grapes. And so they fetishized it and codified it and created this whole, court of master sommeliers, wine and spirits education trust to educate everyone else in the world about what they really loved about European wine, and exported it. And that's what we think is wine. I mean, that's what we have been taught is wine. And it's really just an English colonial export. Like, and it's, I mean, Portugal is this very clear example of that, where it's like the companies aren't even owned by the Portuguese in most cases, right? They're old English companies because the English Navy controlled the world, and they used these ports to get the supplies they needed, which in this case was wine, and they fortified it so that it could make the trip up the coast to the home island without spoiling. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
it,
that's a very. I gotta get you on a tour with me so we can go deeper.
yeah, yeah.
because
Sorry, I know
because
I'm oversimplifying,
I,
but it's the
but yeah, the
I don't
general
know
principle.
who is listening to this, you know what I mean? But I feel like I hope that I catch somebody at some point in their life that hasn't heard this before, hasn't considered this, because it really is an eye-opening thing when you start to think about it, when and then going back to what you're saying about really what wine was this calorie preservation thing. And when you think of it that way, then you just, if you start applying that to where you live in the world, if you were a farmer living in your world right now, what would you care about Cabernet Sauvignon? You know what I mean? You'd be looking around, your farm there in Ohio, and you wouldn't find Cabernet Sauvignon. You know what I mean?
Well, but
You'd
to
be
your point,
finding, yeah. Sorry,
to your
go ahead.
point, that's the no, but I mean, you're making a point that I know is important to both of us, which is this idea that was began in the 70s of commercializing grapes and not wines.
Right,
Is something that in Portugal I see as such a sad thing to have happened now. And to be fair, there's maybe one or two regions where there's a grape that's so distinct and so unique that it's worth talking about, and Baga is one of them. It's a red grape from the region of Bajada, and it has a very unique and specific cultural history. But it comes from a region with this huge diversity of grapes. And the one thing in Portugal, one of our whole chapters is about this, is the field blends. Field blends were, again, calorie preservation devices. So a field blend is intermixed planting of many different grapes. Here in Portugal, I know vineyards with up to 70 different grapes planted in 1 hectare, which is about 2.5 acres, more or less. And they were planted like that so that we knew during the ripening season, at least something in that group would ripen either early or late, depending on when the weather fell each year. And so you come here now, and when the Portuguese, and I won't say the Portuguese, I'll say the wine world, learned to start marketing their wines internationally and beyond their own four walls, they said, "Oh wait, we have to talk about a grape. Okay, well, let's find some grapes to talk about, and let's make a wine from those grapes." And it's just it's become kind of depressing because now you have these single varietal grapes wines all over Portugal, which had this incredible rich tapestry of field blends. And even when
Right.
in the Douro back in the late 70s, 80s, more or less, João Nicolau Almeida took and started doing research to find out which port wine grapes of the many 120 approved varieties made the best port wines. He came up with 5 red grapes that he takes and he he recommended to the IVDP, which is a regulating body, as grapes that would be good. And so people started block planting these grapes, and that led to wines being made from these 5 grapes. And yet we're still talking about the greatest wines coming from the first half of the 20th century when this knowledge didn't exist, and all those wines were made with field blend.
Right.
We're missing something. I think I just, everybody I'm sure on this podcast knows the one straw revolution. And I would assume. But the second book, the book by the translator, the One Straw Revolutionary, it was so interesting reading it. I wish I had it here so I could get the quote. But in the beginning of the book, it talks about looking at a place at its individual parts and not as the place as itself.
Mm.
The whole place is made up of all of these things. It is the individual. It'd be like saying, "Oh, Ryan, nice knees. That defines you." Like knees are part of me.
You have nice
Eyes, I guess. But you have you have a full body. You have a full thing. And we
Yes.
look at deconstructing a vineyard down to the grape or the trellising system or whatever, or the farming. It's like it's the whole thing, the whole entity, and everything there's dependent upon every part of it, including the native flora and fauna that surrounds it or is within it. That reductionist idea of going down to this one thing or that one thing, it kind of drives me crazy. Visiting wineries sometimes makes me go nuts because people, they talk about one little detail but not how that detail reacts or interacts or influences the rest of the full picture.
Yeah, I mean, once you get that ecological, I call it an ecological mindset or perspective, it really just, it changes everything. It really does, and you can't unsee it, and you can't see how disjointed everything else is. And I think it was Aldo Leopold that said something like the ecologist has the curse of seeing, like, dying by a million cuts that nobody else sees or something like that, or like being aware of like a million illnesses in their surrounding land that nobody else is aware of.
Wow.
But it's, and that's a terrible paraphrase, but it's something like that. But it is that idea of, like, I mean, once you see, I mean, what's interesting again is so much of what is taken for normal now is very recent, as we, this is like a theme now, but in farming in general, like this idea of monoculture, this idea of buying a land for its fertility and then clearing it of the plants that were already thriving there so that you can put something that is not native to there, that is maybe not even native to anywhere near there, and growing that intensively until that fertility is gone is just insane. I mean, and in wine, it's still a norm. Like, good, well-meaning, organically farming people, this is still a norm. People are clearing forests to plant organic vineyards, and it's like, are you insane? Like,
well,
like,
but
the forest is
that's
doing
one of the
fine.
that's one of the things we talked about, I think, at some point, where the I listened to the episode with Isabelle Legeron, and I've known her for a long time, but she brought up an interesting point about the natural wine movement and clear glass, and how for her natural wines evolved, the idea of it. And I kind of feel like I have a similar journey to hers in some ways. But this idea that natural wine now is coveting this clear glass bottle, which can't be recycled in the same way that other
Right.
glass bottle.
Hey, I'm just jumping in to let you know about another incredible sponsor of the Organic Wine Podcast. They're called and they have solved a huge problem for the wine industry. That problem is the massive carbon footprint of using glass bottles. Collects used wine bottles, removes their labels, and cleans and sanitizes them so that they can be reused. At the same cost that you would pay for new bottles, you can now buy clean, reused bottles from and therefore also reduce your carbon footprint and reduced waste significantly. This is an industry-changing paradigm, and it's something you can share with your customers. It's a really big deal, both for wine and for the earth. And the earth is why is doing what they're doing. So check out at earth and enter the referral code OWP for Organic Wine Podcast in their contact form so that they know you heard it here. That's earth, OOM.earth, and use referral code OWP, and your bottle purchase will benefit the Organic Wine Podcast and the earth.
And so when we talk about wine, this is, I guess, my biggest pet peeve is that we want to talk about a wine, a place, a thing. We talk about sustainability in wine. We're willing to talk about the fact that we should use lighter glass, but not that maybe we should fly less. And or we're willing to talk about organic vineyard, but we, to your point, we're trying to get rid of things that grow there voraciously, to maintain the story that we hope to tell. So, we have an organically farmed vineyard that we fight against the blackberries from taking over. Well, that it doesn't really ring true. I understand you would prefer to grow grapes, great, and I'm not saying grapes can't come into a landscape and live symbiotically with it. I'm not a farmer, and I'm definitely not an expert on these topics, but why aren't we asking the questions that aren't comfortable to ask? Because this is kind of why we're talking, a year ago, tried to get rid of a plastic bottle in my tourism company. I was sick of giving my guests plastic bottles. Yeah. And that has taken me on the longest road I ever thought I would be on, just trying to get rid of a plastic bottle.
Yeah, I love this story. Please.
Well, everybody tells me, well, it's such a small thing. Don't worry about it. Just recycle it. So I'm like, great. So I go, look, well, plastic, it turns out, isn't very recyclable. And in fact, there's very little plastic that's easily recyclable, and a lot of it just isn't recycled, even though it goes into a recycling bin. And we can discuss that. I'm not an expert on this, but from everything I've read, it's hard. So I decide I'm going to make a solution. I'm going to give all my guests a reusable bottle, and then we'll get a filtered water that they can fill their bottles up with. And I go and I tell my parents, I call them up. I say, hey, Mom, Dad, I'm so excited. We figured out how to get rid of the plastic bottle. And my mom goes, oh, that's great. The other day we were down in the basement and we threw out, like 50 or 60 of those. I said, what? They said, oh, the reusable plastic bottles, we get them every time we do something, people give them away. And I'm like, so now we're just making plastic bottles that last a little bit longer and a little bit heavier and have a little bit more plastic involved.
Right.
So I'm like, so now what do I do? And at that point, I say to myself, well, 20 years ago, I don't remember being, at death's door if I didn't have water within, a meter's distance from me at any moment. But today it seems as though that's the world we live in, that we have to have water close enough to us at any moment, or otherwise we're going to evaporate and disappear. And so, we looked through every kind of recyclable bottle, every type of plastic bottle. We're still struggling with it. We found some recyclable containers now that Tetra Pak, which is a little bit better than plastic, it turns out, in some cases. And we're going to try to use that if we can figure it out.
That's sort of like a box, right?
Yeah, they're the things that you find juice, and it's a cardboard reinforced box. Yeah. And it turns out some of those have more post-consumer waste and have a higher possibility of recycling, depending on, and this is the important thing, if I say this to you, you might live in who knows where, and there it's either to recycle something else. We need to ask locally. There isn't an answer that's going to apply to everybody necessarily, at least not all at the same time. So I bring up this story only to go back to this thing about wine and, talking about one piece of wine, one element of wine. The plastic bottle question is so annoying. It's so frustrating. It's a problem for me personally, just from that, not to mention airlines and flying, which my guests have to do if they want to come visit me. How do I make sure that those flights are offset in a responsible way? Is there such thing as a responsible offset? I think I found some that are. There's plenty that aren't. But I have to take and make a choice to see if I can try a few things, see how they go, and then hopefully, if that works well, I have to keep asking the question. I can't just stop. I can't just go, well, found a solution.
Yeah.
Next year, I have to ask the same question again and not be afraid to find a different answer. And I think
Yeah.
that's the same thing for farming. That's the same thing for sales. It's the same thing for all the sustainable questions we have right now. There isn't an answer, I think, today that's not going to be a little bit different tomorrow.
I love your thought that it's why aren't we asking these difficult questions? And I think I've come to learn that those when we find these questions that like whole segments of things that we participate in are turning a blind eye to something, that there's like a huge opportunity there. And I think that's part of what's interesting about the plastic bottle journey that you went on, because it is, I mean, man, that is still as much awareness has been brought to the plastic bottle. It is just like ubiquitous to the point in planes now. You just the disposability. Anyway, planes are just a huge everything. So we can talk about that separately.
Planes have so many different layers of bad. I mean, I wish we could take cruise liners are supposed to be worse than planes. So
Yeah, well, really? Oh, yeah. If you're on a cruise ship, yeah. I mean, the waste, yeah, for sure.
I mean, look, we have to, if we want to stay sane, we have to make some trade-offs, but we also have to try to do the best we can. I know a couple episodes back you were talking with somebody and you said, there's a lot of questionable things about carbon offsets and if they work and if they're legit. And the truth is, there's
that was
plenty
Isabel
of
as
not
well.
legit. But there's some. I mean, I've spent now 6 months, including talking to a guy who is a friend of a friend who works with very big corporations to try to offset, who's anti-tourism, and he kind of broke it down. He said there are real offsets, but offsets for him, and this is where I'm not an expert. So please, anybody listening, this is secondhand knowledge, and I'm doing the research as we speak, and I'm learning more every day. So I probably will misstep a bit, but he said there are very good offsets, and some of these offsets, a lot of the best ones, don't have anything to do with planting trees. They have to do with helping educate people, because they found that if you can educate somebody who doesn't know how to farm sustainably, you do a lot more good than actually going and doing the farming yourself, because you're spreading the word and you're helping. And those things can be measured when they take place in isolated communities or in certain areas. So, for me, looking at I offset the traveler's carbon footprint, I can offset affordably the footprint, at least with the sources I've found. Those sources are audited not only by the sites that and the companies behind it, but by third parties. And I'm gonna this year try our best. I don't think we can offset everything, but we're gonna try our best to offset as much as possible. And more importantly, and this is the part that everybody I talked to said, do not offset unless you are also going to try to reduce. And that's both brilliant, terrifying, and I guess absolutely necessary is the easiest way to put it. So, I'm not going to go. I'm going to try to fly less this year. I unfortunately have to fly some, and there's nothing I can do about that from the current perspective I have. But I will offset those things using sources that I believe are better than others. And I'm also going to try to cut back. And I'm saying this as somebody who has a luxury travel company with people flying to Portugal all the time. I want the people who come and visit us to understand that it's okay to travel, but we really should travel better. We should travel much more with much more intent almost. I just got done writing a little piece that I may or may not publish, but the crux of it was when I was a kid, I grew up backpacking in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota. And my dad, he took me there since I was 5 years old. And he always taught me saying that I think you could attribute to the Boy Scouts, but maybe not, which is leave no trace. And that means when you go to a place, you pack in what you pack out what you pack in, and you try to clean up other people's messes if they don't do it themselves, so that you leave the better place.
We had one. I'm sorry to interject. It was take only photographs, leave only footprints.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
and what I thought, I said this to my staff today because we were working on a project for a greeting card. We needed a nice little saying. I said, leave no trace. And I said, why doesn't anybody ever apply that to tourism? I
Mm.
mean, when I come to a city, if I demand my cultural comforts, my creature comforts that come from my own place, and I
Hmm.
reinforce that, let's say it's having a triple whatever macchiato at Starbucks, I'm leaving I'm leaving my cultural stain on the city by supporting something that is kind of like leaving a bit of detritus on the path in a place that it wasn't meant to be. Whereas I could take the same money and maybe discover a new type of coffee at the cafe run by the guy
Yeah.
across the street, and maybe learn a little something about where I am. And I thought, why don't we start applying leave no trace to tourism, to wine tourism, to all this travel that we do? And it may be a bit more metaphorical, but how do we take and go to a place and walk away from it without without staining it in some ways with those cultural assumptions, I guess.
Yeah, it's funny. There are a lot of parallels in just in treating people better as well, in terms of what we pay for what we what we assume is normal, like not drinking cheap wine. I think brought that up, where it's like maybe buy a $35 bottle of wine and only do that once in a while versus five $7 bottles or $10 bottles or $15 bottles or whatever it is. Um, I mean, I can only speak from what I know as a winemaker here in California, but yeah, if I know how the grapes are being farmed and what is being paid for a ton of grapes when it's a $5 bottle or a $10 bottle or a $15 bottle, and it's basically you know forcing somebody to work really long hours for minimum wage in extreme heat and weather and everything else. Like that is where that cheapness comes from. It comes from you know somebody at the bottom getting the shaft essentially, um and probably exporting production of packaging to China and importing cheaply made glass bottles from China. It's another way that that's done. And yeah, and none of this is a good thing, period. Like I'm sorry, like
But it's
I
but
know that
it's
that's
but
stepping on a lot of toes, but that's like it's just not good. Like
but it's such a
it's not
holistic
the world
view.
I want to live in.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's my problem is if you're going to travel, even if you're going to travel a lot, you're going to travel a lot. Why go why go someplace if it's just to take a picture of something everybody else is taking a picture of? Or drink coming to Portugal, we have people that are like, "Oh, do you have a Chardonnay?" I'm like, "Well, no, I don't." Oh, well, like there's Chardonnay grown here, of course, and there's some nice Chardonnay, I'm sure. But I'm like, you're in Portugal, you know, a different country. We have different things, and a lot of it tastes really good.
Yeah.
Let's go explore it together. And I mean, most of the people who travel with me, that's not the problem at all. People do want to discover and stuff, but they also, people come here. I have a couple coming in a week, and they say we want to learn which grapes in Portugal are worth drinking. And I can't blame them. They've grown up in a place where they're told figure out which grape you like and then buy that. And I'm like, I remember selling wine. My biggest lesson when I was very green behind the ear and selling wine in Minnesota, I had a customer walk in, and this I remember it so well. I had no clue what I was doing, but I wanted to be a salesperson, so they asked what these wines tasted like or something. I turned to him. I said, "Oh, it had notes of blueberry." Oh, I hate blueberries, and walked away. I was like, okay, so I'm not going to give adjectives anymore. And then the next person comes up and they're like, well, I don't like Merlot. I said, oh, you've had them all, and they looked at me. I was like, that's like a big category. That's a very large category. So this couple that comes, the first thing they're going to hear from me because they're doing a tasting is we're going to sit down. I'm going to say, well, in Portugal, we talk about the blend. It's about the blend and learning about the regions and learning about some of the styles that those regions have. And what does it mean to make a wine in a clay vessel in the Alentejo? The grapes, they tend to be field blends, and those blends are put into the talia, and it's punched down through fermentation and then aged for 3 months. And telling that story, I think, is fun. My tours, I know I have people who think I'm insane when they're done with the tour because I don't talk about grapes. In fact, it's really funny because having had the book come out, I've had some very strange comments because we do have travelers who come because of the book. And
Yeah.
a couple of months ago, I had a guy with me for a couple of days in the Douro, and he came up to me the first day and he goes, "Ryan, I read your book." I said, "Oh, that great. Did you like it?" He said, "Yeah, it's a very good book. Very weird book, but a very good book." And I was like, "Oh, why was it a weird book?" He said, "Well, it was a wine book, but you didn't talk about wine." I said, "What?" He says, "You talked about people, and I mean, it was weird." And I'm like, "Well, who makes the wine?" He goes, "I know, but wine books don't talk about people." It was like the biggest compliment I ever received because,
That's
for
great.
me,
Yeah.
I don't drink wine because of the grape. I don't drink it because of the color. I don't drink it for any of those reasons. I don't drink it because its brand name happens to show up on a top 10 list of something. I drink it, and I'm lucky being in the industry that I am. I'm able to drink it because of the person behind it. I really love picking up a bottle made by my friend Miguel, like I had last night, and just sitting there and sipping on it. And, you know, it's a beautiful, beautiful wine, but it's made more beautiful because I have a nice relationship with Miguel and I know his winery, and I know he's trying to be more and more sustainable. Just put in a bunch of beehives so that he could make honey so that he could work on a vermouth with me because that's one of my other passions. So
And what
that's it.
I can hear some arguments being like, well, it's really, it's really hard to have that kind of intimacy with the farmers, with the wine production person. But my response to that, and I mean, please, give your own response, but my response would be like, well, it's not if you're drinking locally. It's not if the
Exactly.
wine that you're drinking comes from the farms that are around you, from the land that's around you, that reflects your local culture. It's those, and that's unfortunately not how people think of wine, and so
Yeah.
it's not how people drink wine.
Yeah, that's when I have so many different ways I can in my mind intellectually go with that.
Think
I
about
mean,
that for a minute. I mean, to add, to pile on, I'm gonna the as you were talking about, this idea of like people coming to Portugal and asking for Chardonnay, and that of course is possible because of this global monoculture that now exists, where literally everywhere you go, you can just drink French wine. Like
yep,
everywhere around the world, they don't make a local wine; they make a wine that is essentially a French wine made in a French style with French grapes. Literally every wine region in the world that's true of. And I'm beginning to think that aside from the ecological impact that has on our planet, like to have a global monoculture, the maybe bigger tragedy is we've created such a boring world. It's just like we are missing out on so much interesting diversity that we
yeah,
could be
yeah,
experiencing
absolutely.
by having this idea of like this is what wine is. It's so boring. Like wine has
Well,
become
but
so freaking boring. I mean, now there's some change is happening, which
yeah.
is exciting. But go ahead. Sorry, I just wanted to
Well,
throw that
no,
in.
to your point though, I mean, the wine industry. I wrote an article a few years ago called "On Wine and Tragedy," and it was about the consumers not needing to find better wine, but that the winemakers needed to find more consumers or better consumers. And I think this is the problem. The wineries and the wine press have taught consumers that there's such thing as a wrong wine, that you could get it wrong. You could accidentally buy a wine, get home, and be like, "Oh crap, this is wrong," and then I don't know, the house burns down or something. But we've got this idea that we need to identify a wine and understand it. We need to understand the wine, and to me, that is the greatest tragedy because it plays into what you're saying. Um, Wine should be, or not even wine, beverages should be about discovery, should be about having fun, should be about sharing moments. In Europe, you don't even think about the wine, you think about dinner, and then you ask, "Where's the wine?" You sit down to eat, and somebody puts a jar with wine that probably came out of a box or a cellar, and you drink it with the meal because it's in Portugal, it's taxed as food. It's still taxed as food, in fact.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, I think people are afraid that when they don't understand something, I've told you I'm obsessed with vermouth for more than 20 some years. I've been obsessed with vermouth mainly because of encountering Andrew Quaddy's Via back in early 2000s. And I'm about to, as of Friday, I'll have my first personal vermouths bottled. I've done a couple projects, but vermouth often scares people because they don't know what it is. They don't understand. And one of the top authorities on vermouth, always in a book entitled Vermouth, actually, he explains that he believes wine prior to maybe 300-400 years ago, almost all wine was vermouth because you would add anything to it, to your grape juice, to make it more palatable. That was spruce boughs or fruit.
With more longevity as well, right?
Exactly. You'd be adding tannins and other things. And so now being this vermouth advocate and somebody who makes it, and I believe, and this is something you're going to have a good laugh at, I run up against a lot of winemakers who say vermouth isn't wine, and I'm like, the way I make vermouth, it's the highest expression of terroir I believe a vineyard could ever give you, because I take the grapes from that vineyard, and then I take the plants from that vineyard, and I put them together, and I try to paint a picture of that time and that place.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get into this homogeny of wine, vermouth, at least today, sits outside of that that idea of Chardonnay or Cabernet or whatever. And people are like, well, I can't understand that because there's no grape. We've been told we have to know the grape. Doesn't say region because silly EU laws doesn't allow us to say the region necessarily. So I won't be able to understand that. But instead, you have this beautiful beverage, something I think is layered with so much nuance and so many interesting stories, and then people, it doesn't fit that nice little box that they want to have it in, so they look away.
No, you also sort of found me because of vines and trees. Maybe this can lead us to talk a little bit about what's interesting, what's going on there in Portugal. Because I mean, some of the stuff that you've talked about has made me super excited just to think about how wine. I mean, again, it's a place where the old traditions lasted until very recently, and now since they only went through a short period of being out of favor or out of popularity, they're being revived much more easily than in other places. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that might
remind me of who's the person who was on your?
Well, there's been a couple now, but
really.
Yeah, well, I mean, I talked to I would definitely recommend Mark Shepard to anybody who haven't, because he's
in
not
Wisconsin.
He's in Wisconsin, yeah.
Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of.
Okay. And then if you haven't listened to Max Pascal, that interview, he did a huge online article called The Lost Forest Gardens of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Portugal gets called out in that as well. But it's a deeply researched thing about the sort of perennial polycultures that were the norm for all, what is conceivable is global agriculture prior to the modern age, but specifically in Europe is where he focused, because that was that's his ancestry, and he just wanted to go back and see some of these things that have been marginalized and repressed, to find out what actually was going on prior to the Green Revolution and modern agriculture. And and so it's that article is definitely worth reading. It's online. It's just an online article that you can find. But
cool.
That interview is another one where we talk about vines and as well, because that was a
Well,
big part of there's so many, every language, I'm sure Portuguese has a word for that. It's like Alberta and promiscua, and these other words depending if you're in Italy or France, or haughty viticulture, in Hote, and I don't know how to pronounce.
So what we have here is unique because Portugal's this tiny little space that's basically just slightly bigger than the biggest lake in Minnesota, Lake Superior. Just to give you perspective. Yet we have I don't know how many temperate zones there are in the world, but we have a lot of them. We have a huge diversity of landscape, from mountains to plains to everything in between. And we have a lot of different influences. The Atlantic is cold on our shore, so it really moderates the climate, and the interior can be brutally hot. But the place that is known for, and the reason I really jumped on the episode that I listened to, was in the north, in Vino Verde, a region that's incredibly misunderstood by most people. The traditional farming there is incredibly intense because it's basically very granitic soil, so it's very hard to work. And then everybody has very small plots of land. Those plots are sometimes only a hectare, sometimes less, sometimes a little more, but very tiny plots of land because of the obviously it's hard to work the soil as well. But the traditional way, and you still find this there, is let's just draw a picture. We're going to take a square, a nice square piece of land, and your house is at one end of that, and you might have a couple little outhouses around it. But around that perimeter, you're going to have tall trees. And those trees sometimes will be for fruit, sometimes for wood, sometimes they might just sturdy because Vino Verde gets the most rain in all of Portugal. It's one of the rainiest, if not the rainiest wine region in the world. Probably somebody will point out another one that's more rainy, but it's in the top 2 or 3. And it's in that square, you take and you plant all of your vegetables. You have a little bit maybe of corn in the north. If you're a little further south, you might have some grains, and you have your cabbages. You might have, well, you're definitely going to have at least one pig every year. You're going to maybe have a cow or some goats, sheep. And then those trees, you're going to have vines growing up them. And you have that for 2 reasons. Number one reason is because of the rain. It's so rainy. And when it does rain, you need the wind to blow through the vines to dry out the grapes to prevent mildew and other funguses and bacteria and et cetera, as we know grapes love to attract. And so by growing these vines up 20 meters, 30 meters,
Wow.
I mean, literally they can go up a long ways.
Wow.
It might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but I've seen vines where I was like really questioning how anybody in their right mind would let that happen. And
Do you
there's
see them?
pictures. I have pictures, old pictures of these little girls on these spindly little ladders climbing up with big baskets, picking grapes during the harvest. And it's just
Wow.
incredible to see. But in that little square plot there, you have a huge, intense amount of calories concentrated and being rotated throughout the year. And throughout all of that, you're going to take your grapes, you're going to make a portion into wine, you're going to distill a little bit of that. If they're on apple trees or if they're timber that can be cut down eventually so that you can help build other things. But in the inside part of that that's protected, you're going to have all of the vegetables and animals you need to keep your family alive.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's
And
amazing
it
too.
was really interesting as we had a group here for a conference that is based around sustainable agriculture around the world, and they work with very poor African areas and where poverty is unfortunately very intense, and they work to develop farming techniques and methods for helping people to make better use of their land and improve the quality of life. Anyways, one of the guys who is I forget where he was exactly, but he had come and he was a speaker, and I was with him on the bus. We were going up into Vino Verde to a winery for dinner, and he asked about this. I explained it all, and he took me aside later and he goes, "It's really interesting because we do this exact same thing, almost identical in my neighborhood village. We all have our square of land and we grow our trees and we plant some vine or something that can climb up those trees, and then we put everything we need to protect in the middle." And he said,
Yeah.
it's a very common, logical way of farming.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. I know you've talked about some other really cool things in Portugal that may be good to end on. I just wanted to go back before that to the point that you made about education being a uh, a form of, what's the word I'm looking for? Emissions uh, reduction, or an offset, and a carbon offset.
Ah,
Education can actually might be the most important form of emissions offset that we could participate in. And I think what's exciting about that is there's so many ways that can be true. I mean, your life could be invested in that as an educator. Like, I mean, in a sense, I hope that I'm doing that with this podcast, and I know that this is just one way that somebody can educate and spread the word about ways for people to think differently about their world and learn and maybe even if I hope it's not too much of a stretch. You won't you won't think I'm trying to sell you too hard, but like, this is the value of travel. This is the value of seeing other cultures, is the educational aspect and learning to see your culture differently and then realizing how different things could be, and potentially causing you to go back to your home and make changes once you've traveled to other places and seen how it's done and done well and done beautifully and with much less resources and in a much more holistic ecological way. So you know as much as like you said, we need to be thoughtful about travel, there is this really lovely aspect of it that it teaches us to see outside our own reality.
Yeah, I think it helps. What it does for me is it helps me find the questions that I'm not asking. Um, as I said at the beginning, and I keep trying to stress, I feel like somebody who's just beginning their journey in all this in many ways and discovering some books that everybody who's much deeper in, take as the standard texts of the sustainable movement, as it were. But what I find interesting, the deeper I go into this, is that I keep finding more questions, because I don't think we have. I think this what's very fun about like, trying to be more sustainable or more eco-friendly or more responsible, might be a better way to put it, is it's still a big world out there, and there's still a lot of right answers, or even better put, there's still a lot of answers that need to be tested and ideas that need to be tried, and we still need to look at things differently, even when we think something's working right. And I think travel. I have tourists who come and they want to compare everything to their neighborhood. Oh, this reminds me of where I grew up. Oh, this reminds me of this. And you have tourists who come and they ask why. And sometimes I don't know the answers. In fact, that's one of the reasons I love doing tours. Is tourists sometimes help me find questions that I haven't asked because I'm a little too close to the subject matter. Um, I think what I like about your podcast is you've had some very differing, I wouldn't say differing opinions, but you've had different ways of looking at this whole question of sustainability. And every time I listen to an episode, I'm left with a question that I kind of want to go find a new book to grab, or I want to ask a friend if I understood the person you're talking to's opinion right, or if I misunderstood it because something didn't make sense to me. I'm I don't I really am enjoying this period of maybe it's good for me to fund people's educations, but likewise that funding is in turn helping me to educate myself, as it were.
Yeah. No,
Um,
that's great. And I mean, just some of the stark realities that we live with have made me a little, a little demoralized, I'll be honest. And I mean, things like, we're talking, and while we're talking right now, the World Economic Forum is happening in Davos, where, you know, literally 1,000 private jets flew to Switzerland from all over the globe. And,
yeah,
just the carbon footprint for that little tiny conference alone is astronomical.
yeah, yeah,
um it's just those little things, and I'm sure those same private jets fly all over the globe every day. I'm sure
yep,
1,000 private jet flights is probably a small amount of the number of private jets
yep,
flights that happen daily. And in some ways it can feel very helpless, but that's especially when you think that we're talking from places of relative privilege and wealth, in a global sense, where
hmm,
we're not, we're not in poverty, we're not in hunger, and huge chunks of the world are, and their struggles are not with how to not use a plastic bottle. It's like literally how to survive, how to not be malnourished, how to keep their kids safe and things like that. And so these questions that might keep me up at night about how many flights I take are really, it's a real it's a it, it's also very important to put it on a global scale and think about like what are the realities, if what are the solutions that we need to provide for the rest of the world who wants to have to not be hungry, to not be poor, to not live in bad situations that come from squalor, and 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 I think meeting those needs, and I think education is part of that. Like if we know, like I don't know, I don't even know what I'm saying really, but there's this tempering perspective that I've gained, which is, I can do what I can do, but there's, I need to think bigger. Like I need to think about. I guess what I'm trying to say. I mean, here's one thing I'm thinking about, which is like so much of the response to that, to like the global need for to lift people out of poverty and hunger, is about let's 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 burn more carbon, or let's create more emissions to do that. And maybe I look, if that's what's necessary, that's what's going to happen. But then the response is like, well, then we should build green technology so that they can have power and they can have infrastructure and they can,
Yeah.
without the emissions, like, can we have our cake and eat it too? And I'm not sure that we've found that that's actually possible.
No,
I mean, that's what's that's what's scary about the whole situation is.
I mean, to your point, I always get this question when I start talking about this, and as some people say, get on my high horse about it. I'm not asking everybody to change their way. I'm asking people to start asking questions, and I
Yeah,
realize that me, having 10 less plastic bottles and a couple less flights a year is, not even a drop in the bucket of helping everything. I want though the choices I make to be things that I feel comfortable living with, and I don't feel comfortable living personally, even if I am a millionth of a millionth of a millionth of a fraction of the problem. I want to put a little bit of
oh yeah, and
as
I'm
much as I can towards that. But I think
to
going
be
back
clear, I'm
to
definitely not saying don't do that.
no, 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 no,
I'm
I
not
get that.
advising
No,
anybody to give
absolutely.
up.
I
uh,
think you weren't. I don't think you were saying that. I'm just saying that one, I have to put in perspective. I realize that some of the stuff I do, even my small tour company, which isn't enormous, even if I made it 100% carbon neutral, it's I hope that goes to that education thing and shows it can be done. And if enough of us were to do it, it might make a difference. My company might not make a huge difference, but I hope my difference is also getting people to ask those questions. The second thing, and going back to the theme of this podcast, as it were, organic wine podcast, the wine industry. I think this is where I get most annoyed. Is I hear people justifying their indulgences, their trip
yeah,
to 5 wine regions in one year to go sip wine in the vineyards and stuff, or to have an expensive wine shipped in from Bumble nowhere. Um,
yeah,
this to me is a problem because, to what you said earlier, why aren't we proud to find and support the local wines? I brought this up once on a forum recently. I said, why aren't we asking the question, being proud about how little we traveled and being proud about what we found locally to consume? And the joke was, oh, yeah, they can't make wine in, I forget, some northern state or country or whatever. You should taste the crap they make here. And I'm like, I collect obscure liqueurs for a hobby. I love distillates from around the world. Anybody listening wants to send me a weird distillate, I absolutely adore tasting that essence of whatever the fruit or plant matter, or there's definitely other things that they're made from. But I like discovering what's different. I also like people come into my wine shop and they say, "Well, you like wine. Why do you only have Portuguese wine?" Like, well, I live in Portugal. And it's not that I don't want to drink, French wine or something, but one, it's a little hard to get in Portugal, and two, I want to support the local wine culture here, which I think is another element of that, and something that the wine industry as a whole does everything in its power to promote just the opposite. We should be drinking wine every day of the week. We should have a wine from a different country. Why can't we have a little pride in the fact that this year I drink 90% of the wine I drink this year came from 100 kilometers of where I am? And that, living in Norway, meant I drank a lot of cider. I
yeah,
mean, why wouldn't that be a point of pride?
yeah,
Something exciting. I discovered 10 new cider producers who are doing really cool things with alternative, sugar sources or something.
yeah. I love it.
Or I just feel like we're taking pride in the fact that I've tasted a million different grapes from a million different countries, and not that I've put my money into making my community a better place by helping, the people who are trying to do something here. Um,
I mean, maybe
it's
this. You've given me time to think about what I was trying to say, which clearly I'm not afraid to just speak without knowing what I'm saying, which is is a bit of a flaw, but also hopefully will generate some questions. But I think I mean, it's not the only thing I was trying to say, but one thing that you made me think of is it's not only that people make excuses about some of the things that you said, but it's like people make excuses about how they grow the wine. Like
oh
I
yeah.
just think in a world where wine right now is a luxury, it isn't a thing that is a calorie preservation device that enables us to make it through the cold winter, the long winter, especially as those winters are getting shorter. But it is and I hate to call it a luxury because it means so much more than that to me, and I
It's
don't
an
want to.
elective. It's an
It's an
elective.
elective. Thank you. That's good. It's an elective. And considering that there are still people who need our carbon or need some form of energy to be able to pull themselves out of like poverty and starvation on the planet. Like keep that in mind when you make your decision about what you're going to spray and where you're going to import your supplies from and your wine from, because you're burning carbon that is unnecessary, that's elective. To be able to do that, you're polluting the world in an elective way versus people who might need a little bit of an allowance just to be able to eat better and nutritiously, and actually not be malnourished. And I think that's maybe what I was getting at, which is like have a global perspective on the choices that you make for the carbon that you use and the pollution that you put out there, because it is unavoidable. It's unavoidable too. I mean, it is very
Well,
hard to
know that
leave
they're
no trace.
choices, but
Yeah,
know that they're choices and not required. So one of the
right.
problems I have is I have friends and I tease them all the time because they make 5,000 bottles a year, but they're exporting to 15 countries, and I'm like,
Yeah.
what? I don't understand. Well, we need that, and I think they need it. And some of them are friends, and they'll laugh if they hear this, but part of it's ego. Some of it is, making sure that you have a viable brand and you have redundancy in case markets shift for whatever. And I get that. I'm not denying that it's good to have, take and make sure that your market has got opportunity if some certain situation falls apart. But, you know, really, do you need to be in 15 countries with 10,000 bottles or 20,000 bottles? You have high demand. I remember the analogy I tell wineries when I used to do consulting on just on branding and sales was, Surly Brewing, and this isn't unique to Surly, but Surly's from Minnesota, and I remember they have this beer Darkness, and when they launched Darkness every year, you could only buy it at the brewery door, and most people camped out for a couple days to get it. Imagine a winery, Opus One, saying there's one day you can only buy it at the front door, and there'd be a line of people. Granted, the way it costs, it would probably be people paying other people to sleep outside. But, but
Yes. Yes.
oh, you minions, go sleep outside for me. But why aren't wineries trying to also reinforce that hyper local thing
Yeah.
and saying I'm going to do 5 barrels of this great wine, but you have to buy the cellar door. We're going to have a launch party at the winery, and we're going to have a shuttle from the nearest village where you can catch a trainer. I'm just spitballing here, of course, but I think you know why does every wine that's produced have to be on every shelf on the planet?
Yeah. No,
Um,
to your point, I literally I've been in LA for 20, I don't know, over 25 years, we'll put it that way. And just discovered this year a local producer of probably the best cream sherry in all of the Americas. So like and they are making it from old vineyards that grow, that are probably like pre-prohibition vineyards that grow grapes locally here within 50 miles from where I live. It's a Solera system that's been going on since like the 60s, I think, and it is. I mean, and I've had it now, and it's just stunningly phenomenal sherry. Like I would drink it every day, and that's what made me think of that is that's the way they do it. They release one bottling a year, and it's sold out within a week. And
Can I step in as a sherry wine educator
please,
and shame you, Adam?
it's not real. I mean, that's an English creation, so that it would.
No, sherry's a protected denomination of origin.
It's not sherry. What do they call it? Okay, sorry.
It's like
Maybe it
port.
is.
It's like
Yeah,
my friend Andrew Quaddy in California. He doesn't make port; he makes starboard.
it is a fortified Solaris system oxidized
Exactly. It
wine.
could be sherry style. I mean, it
Sherry
could be in the
style,
style of
yeah,
sherry.
cream sherry
Yeah,
style,
like,
yeah.
yeah. And cream
But
sherry is actually not even a sherry
it's
style,
not even a real
technically.
thing, right?
Yeah,
I thought it
sort
was
of.
like, yeah. I mean, this shows how little I know about sherry. I know there's like 5 different classifications, and it starts with Fino and goes up to like Pedro Jimenez, and and that's about all I know.
Oloroso, Amontillado, Palo Cortado. Yeah, cream sherry was kind of a little side branch of that. But yeah, I get your thing. My mom loves a California cream sherry style cream
Let me just
sherry.
say, for anybody who hasn't had a cream sherry, they're delicious. They're just, like I mean, they're sort of like port in that sense that it's like if you want something sweet rather than dry, and you want like, but it's port, but it's an oxidized version of it made with different grapes. So
Yeah.
anyway,
But they're local,
but
and
these
that's
are
what
local.
counts.
These are like actually, I think they're the Los Angeles grapes that were planted by the original like the colonizing mission Spanish mission people originally.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
known as the mission grape, but I think it's
But
I think
that's
it's
but that's my
yeah
point. Like even, I mean, supporting local businesses is so important,
yeah
and I like drinking foreign wines. But going back, I found, and I've been blessed in my 20+ years of wine industry. I've drank some of the greatest wines in the world, and I've drank wines with some very glitterati type individuals in very fancy situations and fancy places, and um, I feel very lucky to have had those experiences, but I really don't remember a lot of those wines. Some of the stories and the dinners I'll remember because of who was there or stories that were told. But I said earlier about drinking wines where I know the people behind them. That's part of being local. I mean, getting to know the people behind them. There's a little
yeah.
winery up in northern Minnesota that makes somewhat suspect liquids, but they could be charming in their own sense, and it's near my sister's has a cabin up there, and you go up there and you go and you have a glass of whatever they're calling it this week, and
Uh-huh.
um and it's fun to know the family behind it and their passion for making fermented drinks. And I remember more about that than I do about some of these fancy wines that I've had a sip of, because it was so expensive I could you know only get a tiny sip from it, because it was basically checking a tick box instead of actually getting to know the person behind it and the stuff. And so I really do think that's something people can do, as is why don't we, at least when we pick up the next time we pick up a wine, that it could be your KJ Chardonnay. It can be whatever it is. When you pick it up, look at it and just ask yourself, as I think the theme has become, I want more questions in this world and less absolutes.
Mm.
What is the question you have? Who is KJ? Who is Kendall Jackson? 2 seconds on Wikipedia, you could read the story of the name, the brand, the man behind the mystery. Um, you could take a second to know something that would give you a human connection to it, as opposed to a rote list of facts and figures that we get from the WSET. Um, I think that to me is, people come here and they're like, "What wine should I be buying from Portugal?" I'm saying, well, learn a style or learn a region or learn, a story, and then go find other wines that kind of fit that story if you like it. And maybe you'll discover something new. Um, so,
Speaking of stories, this is
oh,
the story. No, the story that I want. I would love you to tease for folks who may, despite everything we've said, still want to come taste some Portuguese wine, and fly there to do so. Maybe they'll sail at this point.
they
But
can fly. I'll just,
yeah.
yeah, we'll make up for it.
um, and I really do appreciate that you are a person who who runs a travel agency and isn't afraid to tell people to travel less. So I mean, I don't
Just travel with me, nobody else.
right, right,
That's it.
exactly.
Just one travel. There's only one company to travel with. No, that's not quite right.
um, so I think it's the Talia region? Is it?
Ah,
I don't. Am I
Alentejo. Alentejo is the region.
Alentejo? And I'm thinking of something else that starts with a T within that
Nope.
region.
Yep, you're thinking of the talhas, which are the large
Natalia's. Yes.
clay pots.
So can you that culture? I think would fascinate some people to know about if they don't know about it already. Can you sort of describe what that's a little bit like?
I mean, I'll give you a broader take on it because when we
Please.
started writing the book Foot-Trodden, I had at that point, let me think. Well, I mean, we'd been doing interviews for a while, but when we finally decided we were going to actually put it in print, I had been writing about Portuguese wine for at least 10 to 15 years and visiting Portugal on press trips and, consulting, working with some wineries one on one. And some people might call me a Portuguese wine expert. At that point, I think I'm always still asking those questions, so I never quite feel like a full expert. But we were on a trip to the Alentejo to visit some wineries, and we had heard about the clay pots, but it was a kind of an afterthought. And we were interviewing a winery, and they said, "Oh, you want to see our clay pots? They're out in this outhouse, this separate area." And we went and we looked, and we're like, "Oh, what's this?" And started telling us how it was made. I'll explain that in a second. But at some point, an offhanded comment, one guy said, "Yeah, behind every door in the village, somebody's got a talia," and kind of a throwaway comment. And after dinner, and we're going back, and I start talking to Simon. I'm like, it's really amazing to think that every door has a talia behind it. He's like, "Ryan, that was just hyperbole. Of course they don't. I'm sure there's some, but not everybody has a talia behind their door." When we go down a year later, and this time we know of a producer who's reviving this tradition, and we want to learn more about it. Again, I'll explain a bit about it in a second. But the first question we have for him as we're meeting him for a local pastry at the cafe in the morning is we say, it was weird when we were last down here. Somebody mentioned that, there's a talia behind every door. And yeah. No, I mean, like every door? Yeah. I mean, what do you mean? And his confusion was as great as our confusion at this point. And we quickly pay for our pastries, and we walk out the door, and he knocks on the first garage we come to, and there behind I don't know what kind of car it was a Talia underneath some tarps. And then we knocked on the next door, and there's a Talia behind, the coat rack. And then there's next door, there's a Talia out with the lawnmower. And we're like, holy crap, there's really a Talia behind every effing door. and then we got more and more into it. And, this story is so long. We need a whole couple hours for it. But essentially, this culture, unbroken tradition of making wine in these clay pots goes back. I mean, some say to the Romans, some say before the Romans. There's definitely proof the Romans were making wine in clay pots, if not earlier. But in the recent years, the scourge of modern winemaking, if you want to call it that, in the 90s, had taken and told people that these wines weren't serious, weren't important, and weren't going to be wines that anybody on the international stage would ever want to drink. And at the time, it's probably absolutely true. They tend to have a little bit of VA, and they have a very fresh, fruit-driven idea of flavor because there's no oak. And in the 90s, if it didn't have some oak, it wasn't real wine. So
Right.
going into the 2000s, these things were being found and broken apart and ground up and used in roads to pave roads and things. And when I say Talias, I'm talking about Talias that some of them 300, 400, 500 years old. The oldest one I think we found that's still producing wine or having wine made is from I can get it wrong, around 1670 or so. I have a photo of myself drinking wine directly from it.
All right.
It's unreal. It's unbelievable to see. But the way you make wine in Italia, and in fact, before I even mentioned that, it was in the early 2010, a little bit later than that. It was actually much later, probably, or 13, 14, that a guy named Professor Alindo, whose family had, his in-laws actually had a house where in the basement they had a wine cellar with, if I had to guess, 30 big Talias, 500 liters or so. Some probably bigger, some a little smaller. And he said, we've been making wine here ever since the beginning. It's always been. But as he saw them being destroyed, he got some locals together and he said, we're going to make a competition. And names and dates don't matter as much as the fact that he was able to, the first year, I think, pull together 5, 6, 7 wines for his competition, and everybody was a bit disappointed and depressed. But today, I think they get around 150 to 200 submissions a year now.
Wow.
The region of the Alentejo has actually codified a DOC Talia. So you can make DOC Alentejo wines, and you can also make DOC, this is the quality wine level DOC. You can also make DOC Talia wines, which they had to make some concessions in traditional winemaking for legal reasons, but it's still done in a very traditional way, other than the last part of bottling, which has to be done a little more formulaic so that numbers could be recorded. But traditionally, the wine is basically made in the fall. The harvest happens, and the grapes get put into the Talia with a percentage of stems. Depends on the winery, but you could say 20 to 30% sometimes of stems. And these are, if you know anything like the Georgian culture or the Tinajas of Madrid, they're narrow at the bottom, but they're above ground. They sit on the floor of the cellar, and then they barrel out to maybe 2-3 feet across at the shoulder, and then they go back in very quickly to the opening. And during the fermentation, they have to punch them down regularly, because if they don't, the pressure builds up so much that they'll literally explode. And when I say explode, there's a famous Talia cellar, one of the biggest ones, which is Jose Souza. And he has a broken apart Talia there from an explosion. And the shrapnel that came off of that exploding Talia left divots in the granite walls surrounding it. It's not not to be taken lightly. It's quite impressive. But the wine then goes in, and once fermentation's done, the top is covered either with a thin layer of olive oil or a board or some plastic or whatever needs to do to cover it. And then it's left in there until the day of San Martin, which is the 11th of November. And that's the day that you can open your Talia traditionally and drink from it. And when I say drink from it, I mean literally there's a spigot put into the side of it, and the wine filters through all those stems and sediment and lees. And when you poke the spigot in, out shoots a little bit of cloudy water. But within a few minutes of sitting and letting it drip through the spigot, it's completely clear. The wine finds a channel down through the lees and out through the spigot. And traditionally, you walk around from cellar to cellar and drink from these while telling stories and sharing, singing songs with the locals. Today, more foreigners are starting to discover this, but fortunately, they aren't grinding up Talias anymore. They're keeping them, and they're coveting them. They're prizing them, and it's going to be interesting to see how the pressures of modernity play out as more people want to experience this. But at the end of our first walk around, where we went and tasted from cellar to cellar, I turned to Simon and I looked at him and I said, did what I think just happened happen? And he looked at me, and I've known Simon since he first got into wine, which was in 2011 when he came to our conference in Italy. It was his first wine conference. And he looked at me and I looked at him, and we both just kind of like, we just, our mouths dropped, because it was the most authentic, real wine experience I think I'd had in, at that time, maybe 18 years, 20 years, I don't know. It was seeing people drinking wine for what wine was, which is a social lubricant and a community filament, something to bind the community together.
Yeah.
People wandered the village and went into the doors and opened up. You bring a little bit of sausage with you, and you'd set it down, and they'd have a fire going in the corner, and then you walk over and have a cup of wine from dipping down into where the spigot was dripping into a little bowl. And then you tell stories, and every so often a few men would break out in song, kids running around at your feet. And it was as local as you could get, because the only way you could drink these wines was to be there and take it from the actual thing itself, the Talia itself. You couldn't just walk in without getting to know somebody or shaking a hand or trading a smile. And it was so like where I would hope we could all get to in a utopian type world, where people are worried more about sharing a moment than sharing a stat or a photo on Instagram. So
Well said. No, thanks for sharing that. That is
I go every year.
Yeah.
Now. It's a religious holiday for me.
I mean, that sounds like it should be a one of one of everyone's. Anybody who's in wine should be
Yeah.
celebrate. We should find ways to do that wherever we are. I think that's lovely, and
Yeah.
probably a good place to stop. Do you have any final closing thoughts?
No, I mean, honestly, I feel honored to be on this show. I thank you so much because you've had some amazing people on the show. Some people who I know and friends, but a lot of people who I've learned a lot from. And I really hope the thing that I think this podcast has the potential for is to go beyond wine a bit. I think wine's natural function is as a social lubricant, and for me, we need a lot more conversations with wine or cider or
Yeah,
prickly pear or whatever it is. We need to look at wine as something that can start conversations and maybe not navel gaze as much,
mm,
but help us have tougher conversations about other things, which, in all fairness, a lot of your shows, wine was the least interesting part for me.
yeah, yeah. No,
I hope that
I
isn't
mean, I can.
offensive.
No, no, I can echo that, and I can also echo like I feel honored to be on the show. um, Honestly, when I look at the people that I've been fortunate to talk to, yourself included, I really appreciate your. I think one of the most valuable things that I live my life by is the asking of questions, and you valuing that is a big draw. And and I hope that came across as much as I apologize for my rambling at times throughout this conversation. I think
It's your thing.
yeah, it is. It's my thing. That's terrible, but but
It's okay. It's good. It's good. It's
I
good.
hope that it is. It's also a way to generate questions. I hope me being being sort of fearless in looking like an idiot at times, it allows other people to ask better questions. So and I appreciate you being somebody who is asking those questions. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed that, great, because there's more to come immediately after this. I know that sounded like the end of the episode, but I remembered there were a couple questions I hadn't asked Ryan, and so I hit record and got him to talk about a few more things, but I'm including it as a bonus after this because, maybe this is a whole lot to listen to and you can break it up into chapters. Also, if you did enjoy this, if you enjoy this show, if you enjoy this podcast, please support. And you can do that in multiple ways. The coolest way that I'm so grateful that people are doing is through Patreon. You can subscribe on Patreon, and that link will be in the show notes. And I'm so grateful for my new subscribers. There's a few new subscribers. And for those of you who continue to support, it's like incredibly meaningful and helpful to make this podcast possible. Thank you so much. And if you want to just leave a positive review with a word and 5 stars, a happy word, or a good word of some kind, and 5 stars, it actually is immensely helpful in getting the algorithm to pay attention to what's happening with this podcast. So thanks again. And here we go with a little bonus section. I said the prompts were liquid agnostic, and we don't need
Well,
we don't need another Bavarian coffee shop. We need a diversity of options.
I mean, I don't know if this relates to any of those directly, but it did make me think that you and I, we share a lot of the same ideas. And what I really value about talking with you and listening to your show is the fact that it's not yes or no. And in today's world, we have this big problem where we think that if it's bad, it's bad. If it's good, it's good. Carbon offsets, bad, don't work. There was a corruption at one time. No, there's a big spectrum. In my life, I can count on one hand the amount of times I found a subject where there was not a gray scale involved. It's like there's this huge gray scale of options and nuances and diversity in any subject. And just like I hate more than anything when I hear a politician blame another politician for changing his mind. And I'm like, I don't want to vote for you unless you've changed your mind. And I hope you change it again and
Yeah.
again and again. I hope to next year you come to us and say, I did more research on my policies than I realized we could do them better or different, or maybe that wasn't right.
because the person who
Yeah.
can say I did something wrong and I want to do it better is the person I want to talk to. I don't want to talk to the person who said I've
Yep.
always gotten it right, because you're lying.
Yep.
And so when it comes to
Yeah.
carbon offsets and, and all these other things that we need to do to try to make the world a better place, they're not a perfect solution. And there are frauds and there are good things and there's stuff in between. And I think that's the thing that we have as a problem today is everybody's just like, well, one person did it wrong, therefore we throw the baby out with the bathwater and move on.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, let's talk. let's let's learn from our mistakes. Let's try to find. And one of the reasons I really don't like John Oliver, I used to watch him all the time, is he to make it palatable for a populace. He creates humor around subjects that I wish some people would just stop and maybe not laugh at.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and not
Yeah.
mock.
It doesn't need to be funny.
And you don't need to mock the other
Yeah.
side, because that doesn't help either.
Right.
You're mocking somebody
Right.
who
Yeah.
has a strong held belief who we need to convince of a different belief. So pointing your finger and going, na 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 boo boo, you're an idiot, that's not going to change anything.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yep.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
the reason I was saying when we got cut off, I was saying I love the fact that a lot of your guests are obviously still on a journey of discovery, and that you're obviously on one. And
Yeah.
I mean, just to take a personal anecdote, the first tour I gave in the Douro to the tour I give today, they're completely different tours. they're, com-
Right.
they're completely different information because I've learned so much, and I've modified my opinions on what certain things meant, and I've grown as an individual to interpret things in different ways. And I think, isn't that a good thing as opposed to just being like, well, this is how it is.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the other prompts that I wanted to talk to, I mean, you just, I think you made a distinction between being a natural wine shop and a sustainable wine shop at some point.
Yeah, that's really important. And it's funny, I mean, our wine shop here in Porto was created. Honestly, I helped long ago set up some natural wine events many years ago. Some with Isabella, or I helped her with her event once. And anyway, when I moved to Porto and when we finally decided we need an office, we wanted a small enough space that I could take and do some tastings for our clients. And we found a big office. And in that office, there was enough room to put a little wine shop. And I was just going to put regular wines in the shop. But I realized that it didn't make sense since all my friends had wine shops in Porto and they were all the same wines. So I said, well, nobody's covering natural wine. I'll just do that. And not because I had anything against it or for it. It was more like to provide a diversity to the customers in the neighborhood, as it were. And then I went down the rabbit hole of what that meant and what organic wine meant and natural wine, whatever that is. And eventually we were, I think, the first wine shop on the Raisin app. I don't know if you know the Raisin app, but it's a really good app for finding natural shops or bars in any city in the world.
Oh,
Yeah,
nice.
it's a great app, and by some French guys. And we were the first one in Porto, so then we started to get more people coming here, and I started to then have to decide what is natural, because they make you prove that your wines are natural, which is a bit difficult in many ways to do. Um,
Yeah.
they did it largely by sulfur, whereas I do it more based
Yeah.
on farming. But
Right.
what it came down to is I have a lot of people in my shop who don't qualify under their term natural, and probably other people's. But I just realized, I want a shop full of wines that mimicked, number one, a policy of a restaurant up here in the Douro that I respect. They have a no asshole policy for their wine shop. So if you, wine tastes better when somebody's nice, and that was their idea. So they have the
Yeah.
that policy, and I said, well, that's my first policy. I want wines in my shop from people who I actually like and respect. And the second part of that was then I want those people to be taking care of the environment, and so we say low intervention / sustainable wine shop. And what that meant to me, and when people come in, a couple things happen. One, people will come and say, "So all your wines are natural," and I have to ask them what their definition of natural is. To which they say, "Well, natural, of course." And then you find out, some people's definitions based on sulfur, some's based on farming, some's based on fancy labels or dirty, unfiltered wines. Kind of depends on the person. But then I turn to him, I say, "Well, I have what you're looking for, but I label my wine sustainable because I want the full circle of who they are and what they do to be thought of. So I want them to pay their workers well. I want them to take and contribute to the environment. Or take care of the environment. I want them to make sure that they do as little as possible in the winemaking. My goal is to make sure that instead of just looking at one little pie slice of that equation, they're going to actually be investing in the community and their workers and in the wine." And
Yeah.
People look at me and they're like, "Well, that sounds good." And I'm like, "So I don't know if that's natural." But I do take wines off my shelf occasionally who I feel like aren't participating in making that circle whole. That does happen. um, but
Yeah.
I much rather hear that you've taken and invested the money you make in building a building in your neighborhood that's needed, or helping somebody to recover some of their vines because their husband died, and you're going to help the widow make a little bit of extra cash and make the world a little bit better place, whatever that small thing is. And if you use a little bit of sulfur, so be it. I don't really care.
Yeah.
I just want you to don't look at it as one thing. Don't take wine out of context and put it in its own bottle on the shelf. Keep wine as part of life. It's a social lubricant.
Is this how we got into the Bavarian coffee shop? Or were we talking about like maybe what the appeal of natural wine was? It's not so much that the world needed, a bazillion natural wine bars. It's just that we needed a freaking other choice besides, like the same vinifera grapes planted all over the world. Was that how we got into that?
I
And that was the story you told, or what was the diversity aspect that that inspired the Bavarian coffee shop
Well, I mean,
story?
diversity is it's such a it's such a great thing. I mean, as we talked about many times now, especially with sustainability, people isolate one aspect and make that the whole story. The Bavarian coffee shop is just, here in many places, people will look around and see, oh, they put up um, a coffee shop and they decorate it a certain way, and now they're the busiest shop on the street, and so everybody around them all of a sudden decorates their coffee shops exactly the same, instead of learning the lesson that not that we need Bavarian coffee shops, but that we need something different from what's already there. And so you need to go out and find something different as well. And I think that metaphor, I don't know how we got to it, but at least 5 or 6 different topics we've spoken about all benefit from that same logic. And wine being one of them.
Yep.
Why does wine have to be from a grape? Why does it have to be red, white, and dry? Why does it have to be in a bottle? Why does it have to be shipped around the world? Why can't we see wine as something that you can go get and locally? I love the idea that a winery releases their wines only from the cellar door.
Yeah.
Why not? In
Yeah.
my opinion, sure, you can say we need a diversity of markets so that we're sustainable, but do you really need your wine in Japan, China, Denmark, Germany, Sweden, US? Do you need it in all those places? We have a lot of wine.
Yeah.
And in truth, as much as people really hate to hear this, and I don't care what anyone says, and I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with me because they do, wine isn't that different. It's not that often you run into a wine that's completely different from another wine. Like stands by itself on a pedestal. That so rarely happens. But I do have wines that when I drink them, they have that experience. And the reason I have that experience with those wines is a little bit to do with the juice. The juice has to be good, but it has to do with the label. It has to do with the person who made it. It has to do with the place I bought it or the person I bought it from. All of those things make a wine stand on its own and be different than everything else. It's not the liquid.
I mean, and not to mention the context in which you drink it, right?
Exactly.
Like, if like those memorable bottles oftentimes are not even about the flavor or experience of the wine itself, but where you were, how who you were with, what was happening, that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's
I
like,
mean,
I mean, I often think about like when my favorite wine drinking memories, the wine was literally the 10th thing on the list of what made it
yeah.
amazing. If the 10th.
But
Um,
that's
yeah,
exactly the thing. When we did our big conference, it went to a different country every year. In 2000, what year was it? 14, I think. We were in Switzerland, in Montreux, Switzerland, and every year we had a theme. And that year the theme was wine and context, and it was discussing this whole idea that the juice is the only part of the conversation we talk about when we talk about wine. When wine has so many other contexts that contribute
mm,
to its
yeah,
value. Um, I will buy a wine that's organic, or that I know the person is trying to be organic or is trying to
yeah,
change their behavior. I will support that person and that
yeah.
wine before another wine, um, just because I want to
Right.
be
Yeah, me
part of the
too.
solution. Um, and
Yeah, I say like, oh, okay, sorry
oh
for
no, it's
didn't mean
just
to interrupt.
that conference was really interesting because there was people in the audience who just couldn't grasp the idea that um, we didn't want to talk about the wine. That we wanted to
Yeah,
talk about
yeah.
everything around it.
Well, well, it's sort of like I go, I come from writing and storytelling traditions, and the way I put it is like wine may be the protagonist of our story, but it's not what the story is about. Just like you wouldn't say that, Private Ryan was what Saving Private Ryan is about. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like, you know what I mean, or whatever. Like whoever the protagonist of the story is, they're really just a vessel for the themes of the story, for the val, the things that you explore, the deeper
yeah.
meaning of why that story is being told in the first place. And I see wine that way too, where it's like, yeah, it's the protagonist, it gets all the attention, but that's not what the story's about.
No, I mean, yeah, wine's a social lubricant. It was a calorie preservation device.
Yeah,
Today has become a social lubricant. And we talk about it so much, yet we have other social lubricants we don't talk about as much and we just enjoy the moment. Um,
yeah,
so
yeah,
wine for me, I love geeking out about wine, but that's a specific time and place with a specific type
yeah,
of person, and that's a certain part of my mind. But I also enjoy just walking into a house and somebody handing me a glass of wine and not even
yeah.
telling me what it is. That
Right.
oh, you
Yeah,
want some
yeah,
wine? Here's some
yeah.
wine. Okay, now I have wine.
Right.
Now we have conversation, and now we have friendship.
Right.
All of these things work well together.
Right.
um,
Yeah.
and again, people. I wrote this article. I don't know if I ever sent it to you, called "On Wine and Tragedy," which was all about this. The fact that
Oh no.
I'll send it to you. It's basically
Yeah.
about the fact that in the wine industry, we're always looking for a new app, a new tool, a new method to help consumers discover new wines. And I'm like, look, the consumer doesn't need any help discovering new wines. It has too much wine. What the producer needs is a way to find new consumers. The consumer's fine.
Right.
Quit building tools for the consumer, because the
Yeah. Yeah.
consumer doesn't have a problem finding wine. The only thing we've done as an
Yeah.
industry is tried to teach the consumer that they might choose the wrong wine. And I've never met a wrong
Right.
wine in my life. I've met wines I didn't like, but that didn't mean it was wrong.
This is great. Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I wrote an article called "The Impenetrable Wall of Wine," and it is that experience of being a consumer and walking into like a grocery store or liquor store to buy a bottle of wine, and it's literally just like three shelves of a foreign language, like stacked side by side as long as an entire row, and you have like, how do you make a choice out of that? Like everything is literally identical. If you don't know anything, I mean, like we walk in with a certain level of knowledge that we take for granted that it now allows us to sort of parse that. But it's sort of like telling somebody who grew up in an urban center and dropping them in the middle of the woods and being like, okay, now feed yourself with this forest.
Exactly.
And like there very well may be like a bazillion edible, delicious things that they could live happily for the rest of their life in that forest, but they'd have no clue how to pick them out, you know? And it's like taking somebody, an unknown, you know, like a person who doesn't have even, you know, I mean, if you just eliminate your, you know, the knowledge that you take for granted and you walk into a wine aisle, like you'll just want to run screaming from that aisle.
Well,
You know what
I mean,
It's
I
just
do
like,
it when I go.
it's so intimidating.
When I go home to the
It's
States,
so
I'm so
impenetrable.
confused. I mean, I literally shop by label, and I'm supposed to be one of the top wine experts, at least for a certain category of wine. I've been writing about wine for many years. I've sold wine for many years, and I still buy wine by label. I see a kick-ass label, I'll pick it up and take it home and see what's in there. I tell my customers, they always say, well, I know nothing about wine, so I shop by label. And I say, well, I know a lot about wine. I still shop by label. So I don't know which one of us is wrong, but it's working for both of us. So, you know, it's like we've taught people that wine is mushrooms and that every, you know, 1 in 10 isn't going to kill you. And so people are like just as paranoid, like, if I take this wine home, I might not enjoy it. It's like, well, you're right, but you can always come back and try a different one tomorrow.
Right.
It's not going to kill you.
Yeah.
It's and on top of that, you know, don't worry about how you consume it. This whole idea, you know, Tim Hanna at the MW, he's fought against the idea of food and wine pairing for so long, and I'm part of that fight, that battle, because when I drink wine at a meal, I won't say that I have never had a great food and wine pairing. That's true. And that's kind of my cerebral side, my geeky ex-chef side of my head, where I'm like, okay, these flavors are fun together. But if I sit down with a group of 10 friends, I could give a shit what color the wine is on the table. You know, we're there to talk, have a laugh, make fun of each other, eat some ribs or whatever we're cooking, and have a good time. And sure, with my wine geek friends, we're popping big names and fun bottles, and we're doing that for ourselves. But when I am with my non-wine geek friends, you know, I'm popping whatever is around, whatever box is on the shelf.
Yeah, well, I think that is one of the biggest wastes of time in wine is like how much energy and writing is spent on pairing. And it's just like, I mean, I think the only rule you have to go with is like, do you enjoy eating it? Do you enjoy drinking it? Great. Done.
Yeah, exactly. You know? Come on. I mean, here, when I moved to Europe,
pairing done.
Exactly. I moved to Europe and I wrote something long ago. I forget where, but basically I had a wine shop in Minnesota. And customers would come in and grab a bottle of wine off the shelf and walk up to me and go, so I have this wine, you know, I was thinking, how long should I keep it? And, you know, when I do open it, what foods would you put with it? And, you know, how long should I let it breathe? And when I moved to Europe, that was my mentality. That was how wine is. And I moved to Europe, and the first place I go, we sit down and there's food on the table and we start eating. And somebody says in the middle of it, hey, where's the wine? And a Kanetka, a pitcher of wine shows up, and I don't know what color it was. And neither did they. They poured a glass, and they kept eating, and we kept talking. And, you know, because wine is food. As I said, in Portugal, it's taxed as food. And wine is a cultural element. It's a social lubricant. It's funny because I do tastings here at the lab or shop, and I get couples in here who are so shy because they're like, oh, I'll have to show you the shop. Get you on chat and show you.
Yeah.
But it's intimidating. We have a lot of interesting things on the wall, and they sit down and they're quiet. And you know, pouring small tastings, it only takes about 2 or 3 tastings, and all of a sudden, I'm learning about their family and I'm learning about life, and we're telling stories. And you know, my tastings are always this. They're called omakase wine tastings. You sit down at my table, I interview you for about 10 minutes, and then I open things, and that can sometimes be wine. Be beer, could be make some tea, have a coffee, whatever it is, we end up having a conversation. And sometimes we go deep into, you know, varietals and soil types, and other times we talk about the weather in the Cayman Islands, you know, whatever it is. My goal is by the end of that tasting for you to feel comfortable around new flavors and new ideas.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
It's a lot of fun. I love doing it.
Omakase wine. I think I'm gonna steal that omakase wine tasting. That's good.
Yeah, I mean, I never
Yeah.
know what I'm going to
Like,
open until you sit down. And sometimes we open up for,
how do you make that decision? Do you ask questions that would lead you to discover what you think somebody would like, or what? Like, how do you? Yeah, what does the interview portion of that experience give you information, or does it just warm up the you warm you both up to each other?
I mean, yeah, within 30 seconds, I know whether or not we're going to be talking about wine. I mean, a lot of people
Right,
want a
right,
wine tasting because they're told they need a wine tasting. They don't, oh, you're in Portugal? Oh, you have to do a wine tasting. Oh, okay, I'll go check that
right.
box. And most people like drinking wine, but I don't know a lot of people that like talking about wine. I mean, outside my professional circle, which is quite big, but I'm talking in the general scope of things. People, oh, tell me a little bit about this wine means tell me if we're going to drink it and let's talk about the weather. That's a lot of my guests,
Right.
and that's fine. So if I find out we're going to be talking about other things, I want to know your likes, your interests. I'll ask a few questions about what you do and don't eat so I can immediately tell, are you adventurous? Are you really conservative? And I'm also looking to see how much I can push you outside your limits. So I have a set of black glassware here. And if you're really one of those people that says, I only drink red wine, I need to know whether or not I can turn to you and say, what flavor's red? And guess what color this wine is? Which I love to do with people.
Right.
I do it because I think a lot of people have always just been walked into places, had somebody say, here, taste this. This is made here by this person. Forget. Oh, we did a nice tasting at some place. I forget the name, but we tasted 3 wines and it was good. As opposed to, hey, I'm Ryan. I got a cool history. You want to hear about it? Or you want to talk about yourself? I've had people come to my wine tasting table and just tell me their life story as we open wines. And they're like, what's this? I'm like, oh, this is a Ryan from nearby here. It's a little different than the last one. Yeah, my cousin the other day, and they'll take off and start talking about
Yeah.
something. And every time, universally, they leave the shop, they say, that was the most fun wine tasting I've had. And sometimes it's about the wine, sometimes it's about the moment, sometimes it's about history of Portugal or my history or just letting them vent. And I think that's something that obviously this is something that any bartender knows. If you want a nice tip, you do what the guest needs.
Yeah, I like that.
So
Well, okay. I won't keep plugging you for this stuff because I also have to make this an editable experience for myself. The sponsor for this episode is Catavino Tours. Catavino Tours provides luxury travel, wine, and food tours in Portugal and Spain, and they are guided by a desire to reduce the ecological impact that travel can have by reducing waste, encouraging fewer and more meaningful trips, and by using well-vetted carbon offsets. They are currently booking at catavinotors.com/OWP for Organic Wine Podcast for a fall sustainable and natural wine harvest tour. If you're considering a wine tour in Portugal and Spain and want to have that experience be more meaningful and conducted by a company who is thoughtful about their ecological impact, check out Catavino Tours by going to catavinotors.com/OWP. That's CATAVINO tours.com/OWP for Organic Wine Podcast. And your tour will not only benefit you, but this podcast as well. I'll list that link in the show notes. Thank you for being thoughtful about your travel.